I'd like to introduce Josh Halpern, and he's going to be speaking about Solastalgia, transforming homes of the displaced and disconnected.
Thanks. Thanks. So I have to start off by saying this is something that I'm going to be talking about climate migration and migrants. And this is something that has been interesting to me for a while, but it's not something that I know much about at all. And by no means an expert, and I'm going to be sort of quoting heavily from a few sources, the International Organization for Migration, Hannah Smith of the Climate Outreach and Information Network, and also Jane McAdam of the University of South Wales. So, you know, I joined for the integral ecology track 2 years ago now, and when people asked me what that was about, I said it's more or less about people's relationships with the planet, and that can occur at a whole number of scales. That can be, you know, about people's sort of local water and food systems, bioregionalism, which I think Matt is going to be talking about after me. Or something, you know, as large as climate refugees and displaced people who aren't able to stay or return to their homelands because it's been flooded out, or there are, you know, increasingly violent storms, or there can be desertification, or there can be drought, or all the topsoil that allows you to grow food, you know, washes away or blows away. There's all these different scenarios that are already affecting people all over the planet. So this map I have up here is somewhat of a, the person who created this map, Norman Myers, calls it a heroic extrapolation. And he's one of our main sources of numbers for how many people are being potentially affected by climate change to the point of needing to migrate. The problem is he sort of looked at the places most likely to be affected by sort of ramping up climate change, sort of looked at the population numbers and kind of extrapolated from there. So he's been criticized for not being academically rigorous, and this is one of the issues, and I'll talk more about it. We don't have really solid numbers. There's so many different factors and aspects that go into reasons people move or stay where they are, and climate is sort of an overarching question, but there's one of the things Jane McAdam continually says is it's virtually impossible to, she says it over and over again, a lot of people use that phrase, virtually impossible, to make all the different connections, which is why, for me, this is such a particularly integral ecological question, because we're able to, as integral ecologists, gather all these different perspectives and points of view. So I'm you know, providing this map as sort of a basic understanding, but without, we're going to zoom in a little bit in some of these places. One of them, and I'm sure you know some of you are following it, one of the first places that's going to be affected by climate change and climate migration, and already is Bangladesh. So there's a Public Radio International report of they interviewed a farmer, a 60-year-old farmer from Bangladesh named Vinod Mandal, and he says there's already been a big change in the weather. There's more seawater, more flooding than there used to be, and it's increasing day by day. He has nightmares that the sea will drown his village and his grandchildren. He's very, very afraid. Most of the time he tells us, what will we do? Where will we go? So this sounds like solastalgia to me. And solastalgia is a term came up with by Glenn Albrecht. He's an Australian philosopher and ecologist. And solastalgia, the basic idea is it's what you feel when your home is disappearing. And that can be as close as sort of it's been foreclosed upon, and you actually have to move out of your house, or it's this sort of imminent sense of we're not able to yield the same productivity of food as we were last year or the year before, and the sense of this there's no continuity of life available to us. And that's a huge psychological question, and it's a huge spiritual question. And for me, those are really some of the compelling places to come at this, because since these are such all-encompassing, difficult, multifaceted places, oftentimes the psychological or spiritual questions aren't even addressed. So Bangladesh, which you can see there, it's suffering increasingly frequent flooding. There's flooding about every 3 years from cyclones. It floods out the sort of coastal plains, but also upriver. There's also a lot of issues. The slums in Dhaka, which is the capital, are up to 3 million now, and they say that about 70% of those slum dwellers have moved there from the country because they've experienced some kind of environmental disaster. By some accounts, 500,000 people move to the city every year. And there's sorry, I don't mean to sigh. I have to say, researching all of this is very intense, and there's a lot of work to be done here. So for those of you interested in doing any of this, we also have to sort of take care of one another. So they're saying there's about 500,000 that move to the city every year, and they're predicting about as many as 78 million people could be displaced by floods, cyclones, and droughts in Bangladesh by 2020. And there's not that many. I mean, the nearest border would be India, and India doesn't want them at all. They're actually building an 11-foot fence to keep people out. And so there's a lot of issues like that when you have people who have generations and generations of relationship, who maybe have managed to sort of share the space peacefully, maybe have not, but once the resources that they all depend on start shifting or disappearing, this puts them all in a much more sort of crisis situation together, but they may be dealing with it in different ways. So there's some other examples that we can go to that are going on now. There in Malawi, some villagers are forced to choose between running from sort of rising floodwaters and drinking water. So they go back and forth. They flee the floods and then they go back in because there's no water outside where it's flooding. In Ethiopia and Somalia, there are nomads who are crossing all these man-made borders in search of food. And they don't necessarily see climate change as their most important aspect. They're seeing it's the government who's not providing resources for us to grow and sell and have access to markets and the stuff we need basically for survival. Tuvalu is an island that's already being evacuated because of the rising sea level. Maldives is one that's gotten a lot of attention recently. There's a movie that came out called The Island President, which looks pretty great. And there's also a movie called, I think, Climate Refugees, which does a sort of reasonable accounting of what's going on, though they're pretty, I'll get into this in a sec, but there's a huge range. And some of the, on the other side of it, on the sort of high-end numbers, people tend to think that that's an alarmist point of view. And so we'll get into that. Bangladeshi climate negotiator Muniru, I don't want to mispronounce his name, Muniru Zaman, is calling for a legal framework to protect climate change victims. If we don't do anything, these people will be stateless. They'll have no legal status, and no country will be obliged to do anything for them if something happens. Right now, from a legal perspective, there is no such thing as a climate refugee, which is pretty shocking, actually. So how many are we talking about at the moment? The International Displacement Monitoring Center estimated that there were 42 million climate refugees in 2010, and that would have been 30 million in Asia. This is the IOM. There are 146 member states, 13 observer states. The UN has said that there are at least 20 million environmental refugees worldwide at the moment, which is more than those displaced by war or political repression combined. And it's sort of the first time this was registered. I think it was, let's see. Well, I think the first, well, I'll get to that. Jody Jacobson in 1988 was the first to give a number, which she estimated at 10 million environmental refugees. That sort of ramped up through the 90s, and then Norman Maier, who created this map, he originally said that there were 25 million refugees in the mid-90s, and he claimed that this figure would double, with an upper limit of 200 million by 2050. He hypothesized that displacement would amount to 30 million in China, 30 million in India, 15 million in Bangladesh, 14 million in Egypt, 10 million in other delta areas and coastal zones, 1 million in island states, and with other otherwise agriculturally displaced people totaling 50 million. They're starting to, projections are calling for 9 billion people on the planet in 2050. That's a 90% growth in developing countries. So there's some estimate that by 2080 we could have 1 billion people migrating around. And when we're in that zone of huge numbers like that, I also, not my pleasure to bring up Fukushima. So far, over 135,000 Japanese have had to relocate because of the nuclear situation there. There was a 60 Minutes interview recently where the interviewer asked a woman, "Do you think you'll ever be able to take food, water, and air you breathe for granted again?" And she said, "No, that sounds like Solastalgia to me. Sounds like a lot of things." So, we have fission products blowing over from Japan. We've had that steadily for the last 13 months because that they've in no way closed that area off, and it's just drifting off through the air and through the water in our direction. And that gets into the fish and the vegetables, all that. And that apparently is not even really the biggest danger because apparently the reactor number 4 is super precarious, and it has 1,565 fuel rods in it, and apparently each one of those has the potential to kill 2.89 billion people. So Dr. Helen Caldicott says that if that building collapses, she's going to be evacuating her children from Boston. So, that's super intense. The idea of the northern hemisphere being uninhabitable for our understanding of forever. That's a scale at which, it's a mass extinction event, more or less. And so there's a lot of questions, and I don't mean to put it into an alarmist space, but a lot of this has to sometimes confront the potentials that are actually facing us rather than sort of pretend like it'll all work out one way or another. So getting back into the specific numbers of climate refugees without enormous Earth-destroying events, just as our regular ramping up of climate change. The common claims are settling in around 150 to 200 million people being climate refugees by 2050. And this has been cited by the IPCC, the Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, a whole bunch of NGOs. That's kind of what they're settling in around. And yet, there's no legal status for them, and a lot of them are invisible right now. And partly that revolves around what we're naming them, of course, because we're humans and we can't see anything if we don't have a name for it. So the term environmental refugee was first proposed by Lester Brown in 1976. Other phrases that have been used to describe the people are environmental migrant, forced environmental migrant, environmentally motivated migrant, climate refugee, climate change refugee, environmentally displaced person, disaster refugee, environmental displacee, eco-refugee, ecologically displaced person, and environmental refugee to be. Sujatha Bhairavan has argued for the use of the term climate exiles, and for international agreements to provide them political and legal rights, including citizenship in other countries, taking into consideration these countries' responsibilities and capabilities. There are different legal distinctions between these, but they all suggest that there's a connection, which not everybody is willing to do because of this sort of ambiguity of actually making the direct empirical evidence to link the causes. Climate refugees, the refugee term was concerned primarily with refugee law created after World War II with very strict legal criteria. If a displaced person has crossed an international border and falls under one of the relevant international legal instruments, then they're considered a refugee. If not, and those instruments include being outside of your territory, being persecuted because of your race or religion, things like that. They can't return because they won't be protected, and it sort of goes around that persecution definition and that acuteness, degree and proportion. You might think the lack of fresh water and destroyed biospheres would count as acute, but if it's slowly developing, it's hard to provide proof for that. And also refugee, just the term, there's an outcry after Hurricane Katrina about calling Americans refugees. Reverend Jesse Jackson said, "Is this racist to call American citizens refugees?" George W. Bush says, "The people we're talking about are not refugees, they're Americans. They need the help and love and compassion of our fellow citizens." It's always really hard to hear that man talking about love and compassion. And there were news organizations that didn't use the term refugee; they refused. The AP and the New York Times were some of the ones that continued. Displaced persons is another possible. That's a forced migrant who left his home because of political persecution but did not cross an international border. But also DP has been used as a derogatory term for waves of immigrants. For instance, the Ukrainians who came in the first wave of immigration to the U.S., 1890 to 1944, had some, not exclusively, but had some resentments about the second wave who came after World War II because they weren't forced out. They managed to come over with wealth, potentially. So that, it's interesting the stories that go along with some of these phrases. I'm just going to get into some of the sort of criticisms and the paradigms that are affecting this, go to some of the proposals, and then talk a little bit about the other ways of exploring it, and hopefully that will take about 10 minutes. So oftentimes these are framed by the developed world as security concerns, or as money, of course. The American Security Project says growing political instability will drive greater numbers to make the dangerous journey to the United States. This tends to not hold up because often the people that we're talking about are so impoverished they're not going to be traveling huge distances across the planet without help or without some management. There are also the Asian Development Bank said the cost will be high, about $40 billion is the likely price for adapting and putting in place protective measures from seawalls to regrowing mangrove swamps that have been cut down. And they tend to think of it militarily. The national security experts describe climate change as a threat multiplier and the Department of Stability accelerant. And it does. When you have fluid populations that are sensitive to conflict, it doesn't take much to sort of have eruptions. The Center for American Progress did a climate war game in 2008, sort of projecting on 2015 and 2050 what this would look like. And their whole what they figured out was basically that it's all insufficient, that they have no idea what to do, that they're saying, well, we have some aid and we have some military options, and that probably is not enough. So I'm glad that they figured that out. Range, the fact that there's a huge range doesn't help. When there are multiple difficulties in climate change provides a tipping point, that line is different for each community, household, and individual. It tends to be voluntary up to all sorts of different points. The average over time is what defines climate change, not one particular storm or one particular event. And is movement an adaptation or a failure to adapt? It might be perfectly it might be a good solution in certain circumstances and not in others. So some, let's see. They're trying to define climate migrants. When I say they, I'm talking about the International Organization for Migration, has a working definition of climate migrants that tries to take into account all these different aspects. The environmental migrants are not only those displaced by the environment by an event, but also by those whose migration is triggered by deteriorating environmental conditions. Environmentally induced movement can take place within as well as across international borders. It can be both short and long term. And it's triggered by, it can be forced as well as a matter of choice. And they're distinguishing between emergency migrants, forced migrants, and motivation, because a lot of it sort of turns around that question of what the options are. The World People's Conference on Climate Change also adds that the capitalist economic model is something that might drive people out of places because it deforests and degrades and extracts uncontrollably. Zooming in a little further, the research shows that oftentimes people don't cross boundaries, as I said before, if they don't have to. There's all these highly various displacement scenarios, and the image of sort of clamoring at the rich nation's gate is not correct or helpful. Some places may end up becoming fertile when they weren't before. There's a lot of different ways that an environment can switch. And that's why I think we need an integral response to all of that. Another example where things can go with difficulty is Haiti, where you have militarization, discretional management of resources, international invention that sort of verges on humanitarian colonialism. And the question sort of becomes if you have the larger question of climate justice, where if you have these few countries who are predominantly, producing the destruction and the pollution, what responsibility do they bear for everyone else who's being affected by it? There's been some art which has been interesting. Herman Joseph Hacks did a refugee camp displaying small tents in a little square. And so getting into this justice question, there's a Bangladeshi politician who says just swapping money is no good. You have to swap families or human beings, or give them accommodation, or give them a right to migrate to the countries which are causing these problems in the first place. Instead of the people moving, it might be more sustainable to find some sort of measures for them to be able to stay where they are. And let's see. My notes are sort of a mess. So there's the potential for managed international migration. So merits-based or with dignity. That they're, if you even move some people, you don't have to move an entire population. Oftentimes, the young people are much more interested in migrating anyway. And at the moment, the 53% of the world population is under 30. Not me included, because I just turned 30. But so there's a lot of ways that if you had sort of conscious migration where some of the young people were moving and sending remittances back home, and some of the elders were still there, partly because of their health and partly because they have these deep ties, that might be able to sort of make those transitions happen in sort of a conscious and regenerative way. So the People's Conference on Climate Groups the World People's Conference on Climate Change has a whole bunch of really interesting rights, the right to migrate or not migrate, the right to a dignifying job if you're finding where you're ending up. Yeah, and they are actually one of the only people that's talking about losing bonds with the ancestral knowledge and customs. This is the World People's Conference on Climate Change. There's great stuff, not just on climate refugees, but they have a lot of really good perspectives. And they're proposing that we demand international covenants and policies to sort of respect democratic participation and even just acknowledge the definition of climate migration. They're talking about the human rights treaty for climate migrants, though I actually think that human rights, it's a very good framework, but also it needs to start expanding out for sort of the rights of all different kinds of life forms, that we're all vying for space together. The creation of an international institution that promotes research, that funding, technology transfer must be generated from the capitalist countries as part of the recognition and honor to their historical climate debt, and this technology must be compatible with the rights of Mother Earth and must encourage food and energy sovereignty, monitoring follow-up, an international consciousness court, which is interesting, making visible, documenting, judging, having that be a conscious process. And yeah, so there's a lot of interesting questions. I'll just sort of close with a short sort of going over some of what I see as compelling to me, just based on some of my experiences. Last fall at Esalen, I did a talk on Solastalgia that was largely based on my own experiences of closing out my family's home in New Jersey. And that was not climate-based or forced, aside from sort of economic and sort of psycho-spiritual reasons. But I was really lucky because I was able to spend time in that transition, be as conscious as I could with all the stories and myths that were coming up through the house, all the sort of unresolved questions, all the, that either with the people that were living now or who had lived in the house or died in the house. So being as present to, for me it was particular to that little bit of land, but when you have people who have lived generations where their creation myths come out of the space, there needs to be, you can't just say, okay, that's it, say goodbye in 2 minutes and we gotta go. There can be a lot of different ways where you can set up, relationships with the ancestors and with these sacred places that, if they're not able to continue in the way that they are, at least sort of talk to everybody about that. A little bit like you were talking about in the show before. Talk to all the deities and the spirits and the ancestral lines and all the different energies. One way to do that is geomancy, which is really interesting. Sort of tuning into the ley lines and the sacred geometry of a place. And that applies both to where you're leaving and what's coming, where you're arriving to. 1 minute? Okay. So for me, coming here, I felt the urge to come to know Mount Tam, Mount Diablo, Mount Shasta, because they are important around. There's a lot of people, I've got a minute left, so I'm going to sort of just skip to the end. I think that there are a lot of people who teach about this, sort of learning what comes up through the history of a place. Craig Chalkwist, who teaches here, Joseph Campbell, Wes Jackson, right? We was talking about myth and transforming myth. So I just, what I wanted to do here, we're going to gaze out the window for the last 30 seconds. And just look at that, and imagine this land, which is already pretty built up, increased by a population of a third, which is what they're projecting in 2050. But all those people out there, not just only oriented to cars and money and wealth, but actually to health, deeply rooted, deeply, if we had all those people and sort of sharing this space, but also deeply embedded in the land and nurturing one another, that would be a whole different scene out there. Not quite maybe a irony. So I'm just opening the questions, and I think it's a particularly integral ecological question, and thank you for letting me begin this exploration with you guys. Thanks.
So unfortunately, I don't think we'll answer questions.
Okay, I'm happy to answer questions anytime.
I was curious about the map, though.
Yeah.
Like, just to say what the purple areas are and what the... Really quick.
Purple areas are places exposed to storms and flooding via the ocean. Blue dots are deltas, particularly sensitive deltas. The yellow is prone to desertification and topsoil erosion and that kind of thing. Up at top, I don't know if you can see it, but that's all melting ice.
Okay.
So it's an estimate. It's a heroic extrapolation, but also it's kind of useful.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. That's good.